Chapter 9 deals with climate change. Why is there a chapter on climate change? Well, the main reason is that climate change has been the driving public policy issue globally for the past probably 30 or more years. Why? Well, if we look at temperatures from about 1850 to the present, and we take the period 1850 to 1900, the average temperature for that period, and we look at the anomaly, the difference in the temperature that's recorded annually and that temperature, that average temperature for 1850 to 1900s, we see this upward trend in temperatures. This upward trend was considered by some people as being a problem, and many attributed this problem to greenhouse effect, namely a greenhouse effect caused by so-called greenhouse gases, of which the main culprit was considered to be CO2. CO2 was related or is related to the burning of fossil fuels, namely natural gas, oil, and particularly coal. If we look at CO2 emissions over this period, we see that they rise exorbitantly over the entire period. Particularly if we look at China. China has grown since 1990. It has taken off and is now responsible for the majority of emissions. In fact, China has been growing at a rate that exceeds the rate at which the United States and the Europeans are able to reduce emissions. In other words, if you look at the reduction in CO2 emissions by Europe and the United States, both of which have been trying to reduce emissions, and we include Japan and perhaps Canada in that, but Canada is about, or maybe even below what Japan is. We see that the growth in China has exceeded greatly the reduction that occurred by the US and the European Union. We also are concerned about India. India is rising here as well. Now, why this concern, and how do we go about fixing it? Well, in 1992, the United Nations had a framework, had a conference on economic development and the environment, and at that conference in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro, two conventions were signed. One was a convention on biodiversity, and the other one was a framework convention on climate change. The framework convention on climate change, known as the UNFCCC, was meant to be a process for negotiating an agreement to limit dangerous climate change. In other words, they intended to limit and reduce and eventually eliminate fossil fuel burning. Now, the convention was signed in May of 1992, and it established the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC. At the same time, it established Conference of the Parties, COP, Conference of the Parties. A Conference of the Parties was to be held every year in order to determine, in other words, to negotiate an agreement for reducing and eventually limiting CO2 emissions. The first agreement was reached at what is known as COP, Conference of the Parties, COP3 in 1997, which we know as the Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol divided countries according to whether they were rich, developing, of developed or poor developing countries. Rich countries agreed to reduce their emissions by a certain amount, with countries like Canada agreeing to 6%, and other countries like Europe agreed to 7%, Japan agreed to 6%. The idea was that this would be a reduction of emissions from what they were in 1990 to 2012. So actually it was a period of 2008 to 2012, during which time there would be that reduction would take place. So they had to reduce by 2012, they had to reduce emissions from 1990 to the amount indicated. Only a few countries managed that, primarily Germany, because in 1989, Eastern Germany became part of Western Germany, and as a result, they closed many of the factories and inefficient power plants that were in the East, and thereby were able to come and meet their target. The USSR became Russia, of course, and it too was able to meet its target because the economy had basically gone into the tank. The Kyoto Protocol had a number of interesting things. One was it allowed for offsets. In other words, countries could plant trees instead of meeting targets in terms of reducing CO2. It also allowed countries to invest in CO2 reductions in the countries of Eastern Europe and in developing countries. So, for example, Canada could invest in making a power plant in Eastern Europe more efficient and thereby receive credit towards its own emission reductions. However, as noted, the Kyoto Protocol was not met by many countries. So we're interested in looking at the future. All right. So here we have a look at potential future global mean temperatures. These are the latest projections from the IPCC, and these were related to, they're about 2 or 3 years old, maybe a bit older yet. And they indicate that for some storylines, these are basically storylines, which we will talk about a little later, that the temperature is going to go from an average of 13 and some degrees. Notice that there's a little difference in the starting points here, and the difference in starting points is due to the way the models are created. Some models will start a little higher or a little lower than other models, but the point here is that for one of these models we go from say about 14.8 degrees, 0.9 degrees, up to almost 20 degrees by 2100. Another one down here, which we call SSP, and we'll tell you what that means shortly, we see that that one basically has a limit of about 2 degrees. Now what's interesting is that, and we'll talk about that in the next lecture, is that the target set by the Paris Agreement, so COP21 in 2015, was to limit temperature to 2 degrees Celsius, which meant 450 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. Currently it's about 410 parts per million in the atmosphere. Okay, let's get away from that for a minute. Let's look at something closer to home. I managed to get data for Swift Current, Saskatchewan. They have an agricultural experiment station there, and they have one of the professors who has sadly passed away a number of years ago, collected this data, and he passed it along to me, and he had data going back well into the 1880s for Swift Current, and he created a 30-year moving average of mean annual temperature and precipitation you rarely have precipitation data. You'll notice that this moving average, why a 30-year moving average? Because that is what the IPCC process is using. All right, they're saying if the temperature is going up over, if the moving temperature, the 30-year moving average is going up, then we have a problem. So what we find here is that precipitation has declined in swift current throughout most of the period of the early 1900s to somewhere in the mid-century, hitting a bottom of around 1991, all right, which shows up in the crop production on the prairies, Canadian prairies, and then it's risen, precipitation has risen. Now what's interesting is that in the 1800s, late 1800s, when precipitation was high, there was a movement of settlers into the West. And the argument was that if you plowed the land, precipitation would come. All right. And very interestingly, they indicated that all we had to do was put the plow into the land and it would rain. Well, that did occur in this period prior to the 1900s. In the early 1800s, however, there was the opposite thinking. So in other words, in the swift current area, for example, it became part of what was known as the Palliser Triangle. In other words, an area that extended from the Canada, US, Alberta, BC border up towards Saskatoon and then down to the almost to the border by the US and Manitoba, Ontario. The argument was that it was too dry and it should never be plowed. Of course, after the early 1800s, then we get this rise in precipitation and we get cultivation occurring, crop growing, and then precipitation falls. Okay, remember this is a 30-year moving average. It then rises again, and as my former colleague Les Henry from the University of Saskatchewan pointed out, he was scared that it would again fall and that we would have droughts. Unrelated to essentially what was happening to temperature. Temperature in the meantime, which is marked on the right axis, stayed fairly high and then dropped, all right, into the period of the 70s, and then rose again quite dramatically, if you would like to think of this as being dramatic, up to the current period. Now, if you look at the underlying reason for the increase in temperature, you find something extremely interesting. For the months, here we plot the months where the averages are below zero. All right, so in other words, we've got November here, we've got March, December. This one is, no, this one is February. This one is, no, this must be the February one. The dashed one is December. And the important point is this is the January one. Notice that temperatures are rising dramatically in January. They're rising here as well in February. They're pretty flat in December. They're rising in March. And they're pretty flat in November. So much of the rise in the temperatures in that previous graph occur in the months which are below average temperatures, the colder months of the year. Now, if we look at the months of the year where temperatures are above average, these are the 7 months, we see that temperatures are pretty well flat throughout, with a bit of a rise in April, but otherwise pretty flat. Maybe a little bit of a rise here in September. The point being that it's just the cold months of the year that saw these temperature increases. Now, the other thing we worry about is extreme events. Do extreme events occur? Now there's a whole issue on whether or not extreme events occur. It's been shown that the statistical evidence for extreme events is incorrect. But I just want to show a couple of graphs here. One is the graph of wildfires in the United States. Here we see the number of acres burned in the early 1920s into the 30s and 40s, declining over time, rapidly. Partly probably not weather related, but could be. But notice that it's really low and then it increases again. We got data right into 2023. 2024 looks like it's even lower. What has happened is we think that it's management that has caused these temperatures to, or these fires to, number of fires to, or area burned to be reduced. If we look at the actual number of fires, we see a similar thing. All right, they're up and down, and suddenly there is a huge drop, and then they stay fairly flat. So we can't argue that wildfires are becoming more prevalent, at least in the United States. If we look at Europe, Mediterranean Europe, we see almost the same thing. All right, if anything, we see a slight downward trend in wildfire activity in or the area burned. And part of this is because Europe has been planting a lot of trees. In other words, they've been planting trees in order to offset climate change, to offset CO2 emissions. And it seems that that as well is causing more fires, that it's not the higher temperatures. So we may be wrong in some of this stuff. So let's look a little bit at the economics of it. Climate change is a global externality. So if we did not have climate change, and we're looking at CO2 emissions from fossil fuels, if we had no cost of using fossil fuels at all, then we would be going to where the marginal benefits of an extra unit of fossil fuel burning occurs at point U. In other words, that's the maximum amount of CO2 that we would emit from fossil fuels, given this marginal benefit function from having fossil fuel use. However, there is a cost, a private cost to using fossil fuels. This is indicated by this supply curve, the marginal private cost. And as we saw in earlier chapters, such as chapter 4, we see that the equilibrium E is where we get the maximum of the consumer surplus plus the producer surplus. However, there's an externality cost. It's a global externality, which shifts that supply curve to S prime. So we have a marginal social cost, which includes the marginal private cost plus the cost imposed on others. In that case, we see that the cost of the externality is given by D prime D, E prime, and we've been able to eliminate or address some of that cost. So now E prime and QC is the amount of fossil fuel burning we should do, or the amount of CO2 emitted at least from fossil fuel burning. Without any action, we would be at Q star. If government policy is implemented correctly, we would be at QC. The problem with a no fossil fuel burning at all means you've shifted that supply curve to S double prime, in which case you would have absolutely no CO2 emissions from fossil fuels. So that's the economic graph. Now, how do we look at, or how do we get to any decision making regarding climate change and what to do about it and how bad it is? Well, scientists use what are called integrated assessment models. What do they do? Well, scientists use them to inform decisions pertaining to climate change. So scientists and economists have developed a suite of tools known as integrated assessment models. They're integrated because they combine different strands of knowledge to model human society alongside the parts of the Earth system. In other words, the socioeconomic system and the physical Earth system. So they explore how human development and societal choices interact with and affect the natural world. So they're designed, these IAMs, or integrated assessment models, are designed to help us understand how human development and societal choices affect each other in the natural world. They take into account the physical laws driving natural systems, but they consider the changing habits and preferences that drive human society. Now, a famous economist has described these integrated assessment models as being too ad hoc, Robert Pindyck, and others as the complex tasks they address introduce many uncertainties and limitations. So many economists have, and other scientists have said, well, you can't use these kind of models, they're too ad hoc. Yet, these integrated assessment models offer valuable insights about how the world's energy and land use systems would need to respond to climate change. So how do these models work? Well, the first level of modeling is that it divides the economy into two sections. An energy section, into three. An energy section, a land use section, and an industrial commercial section where we have supply of goods and services and demand of goods for goods and services at, I guess, the consumption or the consumer level. Here we have supply of cropland, pasture, forest, biomass, non-market goods and other goods, and demand for food, fuel, forest products, ecosystem services, etc. And on the energy side, we have fossil fuel burning, nuclear, biomass, wind, solar, and demand for transportation, space heating, electricity, and other demands. And we trade these things in the economy between consumers and producers, and this forms the economy. But the economy is not just related to these things, it's related through trade to other countries. All right, so we have all these separate units: energy, land use, industrial, commercial, of course, consumer, final consumer markets, and trade. And within this trade is where the domestic trade occurs as well. And we get greenhouse gas emissions from that. And we then take that information, all of this information, plus the greenhouse gas emissions, and put them into a climate model. All right. But before we do that, we have to make decisions about GDP, population, growth, technology, the natural resource base, which is affected by the technology, and we come through the economy with the greenhouse gas emissions and what affects the climate model. Then that goes back up and it affects the economy through such things as changes in policies, changes in temperature, and so on, so forth. And of course, changes in temperature or CO2 will affect the natural resource base. Think of CO2 fertilization increasing tree growth and crop growth. So what we do is we make these integrated assessment models. We feed GDP into them, population, policies, other assumptions over time. And we look at how these affect the economy, energy system, land system, climate, and we then get economic outcomes, emissions. By economic outcomes, we mean, I guess, GDP, emissions of CO2 and a vast number of other types of greenhouse gases and non-greenhouse gases and other things like wastes and so on. we identify energy pathways, and we look at land use. Now these models are quite large, and we don't have a huge number of them. In fact, there are more climate models than there are these integrated assessment models. So we have, these are the main ones, and there are a lot of other smaller ones, but these are the ones that are used primarily by the IPCC process. Image, GCAM, Remind, Message, and AIM. Right, Netherlands, US, Germany, Austria, and Japan are the host countries for those. So I've drawn up a little schematic, because there are more than these, and I've come up with these other integrated assessment models, and I call them stage 1 scenario-based integrated assessment models, which provide the shared socioeconomic pathways and representative concentration pathways. These are the representative concentration pathways. They tell you how much greenhouse gases of various types are emitted over a period of time between, say, 2000 and 2100, or between 2020 and 2100. And these shared socioeconomic pathways are also basically inputs from the IPCC process. In other words, the IPCC develops storylines, and these storylines are then used to create these shared socioeconomic pathways, which are then used within these climate models, as shown in the earlier slide, to develop these representative concentration pathways. Once that information has been provided, we actually get a path of CO2 emissions, say, of methane emissions, and so on. These are fed then into these second stages, I'll call them, these global climate models, of which there are some 50 or 60, and I've listed some of the biggest or most well-known ones, including the Canadian Centre for Climate Modeling and Analysis, and the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory in the US, the Commonwealth Scientific and Research Organization of Australia, and the Max Planck Institute for Meteorology in Germany. They run these global climate models. These models take, sometimes a year to run, but mainly 40 or 50 days, say. And then finally, the temperatures that come out of these are put into these three-stage economic optimization integrated assessment models, of which the most famous is probably DICE, the Dynamic Integrated Climate and Economy model by William Nordhaus, but also FUND, the Framework for Uncertainty, Negotiation, and Distribution, which was created by Richard Tull, and PAGE, the Policy Analysis of the Greenhouse Effect by Chris Hope. Both DICE and FUND are publicly available. PAGE is not. It's a proprietary model. So the 5 main shared socioeconomic pathways, these are the storylines that are developed by the IPCC outside of the modeling. So SSP1 is the shared socioeconomic pathway 1, which is focused on sustainability, a world focused on sustainability and inclusive development. SSP2 is middle of the road, a world following historical trends without major changes. SSP3, regional rivalry, a fragmented world with regional conflicts and slow economic growth. SSP4, inequality, a world with high inequality and uneven development. SSP5, fossil fuel development, a world with rapid economic growth driven by fossil fuels. To give you an idea of some of these assumptions, all right, we look at what the population was in the year 2050. It was about 6.5 billion people. Purchase power parity gross domestic product per person was in US $2,005. You can almost double that for today, and we look at emissions from fossil fuels and industry in terms of megatons of CO2, total energy use in ecojoules, and energy from coal. So how do these differ? Well, we start with the baseline, and SSP1 indicates that by 2050, GDP would be, per person globally, would be about 34,000. So you could double that, so about 68,000 in today's dollars. And it would be 81,000 per person in 2100. All right. Drop to SSP2, we get 25,000 and 59. SSP3 is less so, partly because of the higher population that's expected. Notice here that population in SSP1 goes up and then comes down. It goes up and comes down in SSP2, but it goes up and goes even higher in 3. In 4, it's pretty well levels off, and in 5, it also drops. But in 5, look at the high income here. We reach 43, 44,000, so that'd be 80-some thousand dollars already in 2050, and over 200,000 in today's dollars in that period of time. But notice also that we rely heavily on fossil fuels for SSP5, and our total energy use is really, really high. All right, this is how much comes from coal, higher than pretty well everyone except for SSP3. Okay, and even this one reaches fairly high as well. So these are the kind of inputs, and there's many, many more that go into these integrated assessment models. And there's also technological changes that go into them, and assumptions about how fast the least developing countries in the world converge to the incomes of, or per capita GDPs of, those in the rich world. Because remember, one of the goals of the United Nations is this whole notion of convergence, and that occurs particularly in SSP5. Now, the climate models use these shared socioeconomic pathways to calculate radiative forcing levels that align with the RCP as follows. So these are your representative concentration pathways. Socioeconomic assumptions. Each SSP outlines specific assumptions about population growth, economic development, energy use, and policy implementation. The energy use and policy implementation go through the model, these IMs. Emission scenarios. Based on these assumptions, emission scenarios are developed. These scenarios consider how socioeconomic factors influence greenhouse gas emissions. Climate modeling. The emission scenarios are fed into climate models to project future concentrations of greenhouse gases. Radiative forcing calculation. The models calculate the resulting radiative forcing, which aligns with one of the representative concentration pathways. So these have to be targeted. And how do they target them? Well, they've developed these representative concentration pathways 2.6, a pathway aiming to keep radiative forcing below 3 watts per meter squared, which is approximately the current level. Actually, the current level is a little bit higher, peaking around 2020 and then declining. All right, notice that this is a bit old already. 4.5, a stabilization scenario where radiative forcing stabilizes at 4.5 watts per meter squared after 2100. So really these are targets for what the radiative forcing would be in 2100. Now in 2100, remember this radiative forcing is the difference between an atmosphere with and without CO2. Okay, so with CO2 you get this forcing, and without CO2 you don't get the forcing. So what they're saying is that by 2100, you get a forcing of 4.5 or 6.0 or 8.5. And of course, the higher the forcing, the higher number of watts per meter squared reach Earth, then the greater you've got problems. Now, what's the total amount of watts that the Earth receives currently? It's about 274 watts per meter squared. All right, so that means we'd be increasing them by about 8.5 or 6, depending on the assumption, or even 4.5. Turns out that these lower ones, of course, are going to lead to less or not as high temperature changes. So if we look at the parts per million of CO2 required, okay, remember, we're at 410 now. If we want to reach this higher level of RCP 8.5, we have to hit 1300 by 2100, and then we predict an increase of temperature of 4.43 degrees Celsius as the average increase for the globe. For RCP 6, it'd be 3.4 degrees Celsius. For RCP 4.5, 2.6 degrees Celsius approximately, and less than 2 degrees Celsius, but slightly above 1.5 degrees Celsius for the lowest one. Notice that with the lowest one, you're down around here somewhere.